I'd like to welcome all of you to the IPI Arab Intellectual Series. Today, we are honored to have Mr. Jamal Benomar, who will speak comparatively on his experience in Yemen and whether that is relevant to Syria. I want to start by paying tribute to Mr. Benomar. You know, he's a friend of mine for the last 10 years. I know him when he was working with Ibrahimi in Iraq. And Jamal was the UN invisible soldier in Baghdad. When Ibrahimi did his round trips around the region and the world, it was Jamal who kept the UN office functioning and also who was in touch with the Iraqi insurgency. And you know, as a diplomat, I made good use of his connection to the insurgency, so I knew what was going on in Iraq. Jamal is a man of impeccable credential. He's a Moroccan. He went to the Sorbonne and to the University of London, and he worked for the Carter Center in Atlanta before he joined the United Nations. Of course, I knew him when he was in UNDP, before he worked in the Department of Political Affairs. And I was elated when he was chosen to serve in Yemen, because I know that his heart is in that part of the world. He wants to foster peace and stability in Yemen and in the region in general. But I would like also tonight, our focus to be on Syria. I am concerned about the gathering war clouds in the Levant. There is a prospect for a protracted war in Syria. And one asks the question, what will convince an intransigent leadership in Damascus to reverse course and listen to the aspirations of its people for democracy, freedom, rule of law? And one can ask the question, is transfer of power from President Bashar al-Assad to his long and trusted vice president, Farouk al-Shara'i, is that possible? And if he does that, of course, he will be accorded immunity from prosecution since the Assad reign started. Of course, it's over 40 years. This is exactly what happened in Yemen, that the president transferred power to his vice president. But the question becomes, will Assad transfer power or wait for transfer of power like his counterpart in Yemen until the pillars of the temple collapses? Because this is exactly what happened in Yemen. In Yemen, after the 18th of March massacres, the president came to the conclusion, President Saleh, that his rule began to collapse, and it's better to offer an exit out of this situation. I was disturbed by the lack of progress in the meeting, the summit meeting, Russian-US summit meeting, at the margin of the G20 meetings in Mexico, it seems that they failed to secure an agreement on Syria. So the question, will Syria pay for competition between big powers and for their power politics and balance of power calculus? Will the Syrian people pay for that? In the case of Yemen, and we are very glad, and I repeat this all the time, that Yemen was saved by the international community. That without the unity shown in the Security Council, without regional unity in the Gulf Cooperation Council, and without the help of the Secretary General as represented by Mr. Benomar, Yemen would have suffered a worse fate than Syria. And you know the reasons. Yemenis are much more armed. It's a mountainous country, larger than Syria, and it would have been very, very difficult to control. But admittedly, Yemen remains in a state of limbo. But I know the special advisor, Mr. Benomar, backed by the strength of the Security Council, ensures that the process, peaceful process, is moving on. The question becomes, are the conditions, the sectarian and ethnic mosaic in Syria notwithstanding, is there a possibility for a resolution of the Syrian crisis in a way similar to the Yemeni crisis, to the way that the crisis in Yemen was resolved? That is to say, can the international community rise above petty politics, especially the big powers, and try to find a solution to the Syrian crisis? Because it seems to me, this is my view, and I will let Jamal speak to that later, that in Syria there is no option other than a peaceful negotiation, peaceful transfer of power. But this will not take place until the regimes feel that it is no longer in a position to defeat the opposition. I think the regime in Damascus still believes that it has the strength to defeat the opposition and impose its own logic. I don't think that will happen, but I will stop here and give the floor to my friend Jamal Benomar, who will reflect on his experience both in Yemen and then speak about the Syrian matter. Jamal, you have the floor.
I've always valued our friendship and your advice and your help. Yemen is a country with a long history and a culture and with lots of politics. And one thing that I've been telling my colleagues is that as a representative of the Secretary General, whenever we are tasked with tasks such as the one I have now, doing good offices on behalf of Secretary General, we have to humble ourselves and also recognize that no matter how much we know about the country, these countries are very complex. And Ambassador Abdullah is one of the good friends who try to help me understand the nuances and the complexities. One thing I have to say from the outset is that what happened first in Yemen is very different from other situations of Arab Spring, uprisings. And I think before we even begin to think of transplanting, the Yemeni model, or think of it as a model for Syria, let's understand first what happened actually in Yemen. Because the Yemen story has a history, and it's complicated. It's complicated, and it's still also unfolding. First, it's true that it all started with the youth occupying squares throughout the country and chanting slogans, demanding change, democracy, and rule of law. But this took place also in a country that has had a number of conflicts and armed conflicts running concurrently. In the country, there was a Houthi insurgency in the north, 6 rounds of fighting and war. And when the youth took to the street, the Houthis were, in fact, occupying and in control of almost a province. Since then, they expanded their control, not only becoming in total control of the province of Sada, but expanded to other areas, other adjacent provinces like Amran, Hajja, Al-Juf, and so on. In Yemen also there was, before the youth uprising, a southern movement called Hirak that started in late 2006. It started as a right-based movement demanding end to discrimination, justice, a different type of relationship between North and South, but it was met with repression, and the movement became more and more radicalized, ending up with factions within this movement, not all factions, with very maximalist agenda, demanding independence for the southern region and so on. Also, in the context of the uprising, one thing that happened also is that one part of the armed forces, the first armed division, led by General Ali Muhsin, declared their opposition to President Ali Abdullah Saleh and declared that they will join the protesters and the youth. Also, one thing that we've seen, in the case of Yemen, a country that is the most tribal in terms of traditional structures in the Arab world, and with probably it's the country where arms are available, including the heavy weapons available to private ordinary citizens. And it is in this context that one part of the uprising and one actor that became very important in this uprising also was the tribal militias led by members of the Al-Ahmar family, or sons of Sheikh Ali Abdullah. It is in this context of this very complicated situation with many actors and so on that the state started to collapse. The state lost control over various parts of the country, and people suffered throughout the crisis with electricity cuts that became very severe, increase in food, the prices of foodstuffs, lack of fuel, and so on. And the general situation became unbearable to the most vulnerable groups. It is in this context of the crisis that an initiative emerged from the GCC countries. This was in April, May. The opposition signed it because they knew that the president wouldn't sign. And definitely the president refused to sign, leading to a prolonged deadlock over several months. We had concerns, about, the initiative itself. We supported the effort 100%, but as United Nations, we had an issue with the main element of the initiative, which is the immunities deal. You transfer power in exchange for total immunity, not only for the president, but the way it was worded, to all those who worked with him, which could be all security forces, it could be hundreds of thousands of people. One issue that we wanted to address also in the context of this initiative was its inclusion deficit. As I stated earlier, when we talk about the actors in Yemen, we're talking about the youth, we're talking about the Houthis, Iraq, parliamentary parties, the ruling party, civil society, and a number of other people, have a lot of power because they have guns, like General Ali Mohsin and the Al-Ahmar's militia. So the one position that we took early on is that the solution in Yemen, one, can only be a Yemeni solution. It can never be imposed from outside. Yemenis will need to take responsibility and find a way out of the crisis. And we said this repeatedly, from the outset. Second, we said, and this was not at some point popular, we said this can only be settled through face-to-face negotiation among Yemenis. And then three, we said the process, in addition to being Yemeni and face-to-face negotiations, it needs to have an element of inclusion. There are many actors, and a way needs to be found to bring them into the political process. It was after several months of the crisis, that the Security Council issued Resolution 2014. And I must say that in this case of Yemen, the Security Council played a very important role, a very positive role. It is the resolution that created the momentum, the Security Council speaking with one voice, combined with the voices of the actors from the region, the GCC and others in the international community. This is what created the momentum to the talk about face-to-face negotiations finally taking place, with at the request of both sides, with UN facilitation. It was, I still remember me briefing former President Ali Abdullah Saleh about what will be my first briefing to the Security Council under Resolution 2014, telling him and others, that my report will say that there is no progress when it comes to the political settlement that the Security Council resolution called for, that my report, will contain details about continuing human rights violations, that my report, will contain more information about the violence that escalated in Taiz and other parts of the country. But it is really the realization by both sides in the conflict, the opposition with all its trends, and the ruling party, that they are on the verge of entering into a very dangerous phase, entering a civil war, and all of them aware that the international community is speaking with one voice, calling for a political settlement, that, and I think with the Security Council and speaking with one voice, and the pressure from the region and beyond, creating the conditions that led to these face-to-face negotiations that I facilitated, and it ended with a detailed agreement. The challenge for us at that time was that Yemenis have a history of coming to very general agreements that don't go beyond very general principles. And the temptation was, with the pressures at that time, was for them again to produce an agreement that is very vague. As UN, learning from the past experiences of many agreements that were flawed, that led to more armed conflict, our advice to the Yemenis is that they need to get to a very decent level of detail on how this transition is going to be triggered, how this transition is going to be organized, how this transition is going to be administered, and also it has to address, the main issue, which is how to an agreement be drafted in a way that can at least not trigger opposition from those who are not involved in the process. But the ideal would be an agreement that will open the way for broader participation of the other actors, but also an agreement that is acceptable to the international communities, has to be in conformity with Resolution 2014, and we always insisted with the Yemenis that the agreement be in the context of the GCC initiative, and that's why, we invented the name for the agreement when it was signed, the implementation mechanism of the GCC initiative, instead of calling it something else completely separate from the GCC. And this is the reason why it was my suggestion that the agreement be signed also in Riyadh. We worked hard on that, one long night, to make the arrangement for it, it happened. So just few elements that I want to remind you of is that the key element of the transition agreements, have a number of principles, that revolve around explicit language on human rights, rule of law, women's rights, and democracy. So it's clearly and explicitly stated that this agreement is in the context of responding to the aspirations of the youth for change and their aspirations to build what they call a civil state based on the rule of law. And that was the context. Second, it has a fair degree of details in terms of how this transition is organized. There was a phase one where its duration is 3 months from the signing of the agreement. The vice president had then all the presidential powers necessary for the implementation of the agreement. There was agreement that elections will take place. And here there was an innovation in the Yemeni case, early elections, but with a consensus candidate. The agreement didn't prevent other candidates from coming forward, but in the agreement, both the opposition and the ruling party decided that Vice President Abdurrabbu Mansour Hadi will be their consensus candidate, something that is unique. It happened, in fact, because of the personality of the vice president at the time, Abdurrabbu Mansour Hadi. He was from the ruling party, the number 2 in the ruling party, but at the same time, he had the trust of all the opposition. That's what made him in a very unique situation. But also in the agreement, it was a transformative agreement in the sense that it talks about creating new institutions that will address big challenges for Yemen. And one of the big challenges is the fragmentation and the division in the armed forces and the security forces. And that's why, in the context of the agreement, there was a provision for the setting up of a military affairs committee that will start focusing on 2 issues. One, a set of stabilization measures, making sure that armed formations and militia leave the cities, opening roadblocks and so on, but also addressing the long-term objective of security sector reform. In addition to this, and this is one of the innovations of this agreement, and again, to address, the issue of inclusion. In this context, there was agreement that a national dialogue conference will take place, and the national dialogue conference will bring, and in the agreement it's clearly stated that participants will be women, youth, Hirak, the southern movement, Houthis, in addition to the ex-ruling party, GPC, and also the coalition of parliamentary opposition parties. There was an agenda also that was agreed on in the context of the agreement. The National Dialogue Conference will address the southern question, will seek to find a just solution, as it's stated in the agreement, to the southern question. So all Yemenis coming together to address the big issues, the big challenging issues, also addressing the root causes of conflict in Sada, but also beginning the process of constitution making by addressing 2 key questions. The first one is the nature of the political system, and the second question, the structure of the state, which is related also to the issues of the South and Sada. In addition to this, addressing issues of national reconciliation, transitional justice, and then development issues and how they relate also to vulnerable groups. So what we have here is a roadmap, that's clearly detailed how this transition will work, both in the first phase and the second phase, ending with elections, which is the legitimate way of addressing competition for power. Elections in February 2014, but before getting to elections, agreeing on the new rules of the game and agreeing on the new social contract in the context of the national dialogue and the constitution-making process. Few issues also that I can address, in the context of the discussions, about Syria, because we're always talking about what we can learn, from the Yemeni experience. I wouldn't say that, we need to transplant the Yemeni model. This model is unique to Yemen, and it's the outcome of the Yemeni history, Yemeni circumstances, and so on. And let me remind you of some basic facts about Yemen and why the situation in Yemen is very different from Syria. First, Yemen has a history of politics. Yemen has a history of political parties. There is a socialist party, there is an Islah party that was in government and then in opposition. There is a there is a civil society, pretty sophisticated. Parliament even, this last parliament took various initiatives challenging government about corruption and so on. There were several elections, and in fact the last election of 2006, according to the report of the European Union, was fairly fair. So, this is one thing that it's worth, I think, keeping in mind. Yemen has a history of politics, has a history of civil society and democratic space. And that's what makes the situation very different, from Syria. Yemen also has a history of power-sharing arrangement, because at the end of the day, the Yemeni solution was a power-sharing arrangement. Bottom line was that both the opposition and the ruling party were not able, to turn the situation militarily to their own advantage. The balance of power for many months remained 50-50. And I remember my talks with various parts of the opposition, challenging them, and many realizing that definitely what is needed is a peaceful solution, because an all-out war, civil war, military solution is not in anybody's interest, and it's not guaranteed that if they enter into a civil war scenario, all-out war, they're going to win. The same thing when it comes to the Yemeni side. It's public knowledge that former President Ali Abdullah Saleh formed a military commission, asked a number of military officers on what it will take, for the military loyal to him to prevail, the prospects of a military solution. And it is public knowledge that high-ranking military officers who were asked this question, who studied this issue, came back with the answer that there is no military solution that is possible. Now, I said that there is a history of power-sharing arrangement. During the 90s, both, the Socialist Party, the Islah Party were in power, and there was also another element of power-sharing. In fact, when you look at the history of the last 20 years or the last 33 years of Yemen, ex-President Ali Abdullah Saleh didn't rule by himself. He was allied with some powerful figures, with a huge social base. One is General Ali Muhsin, who was considered for a long time as the number 2 man, in the regime, and also Sheikh Abdullah Al-Ahmar, who died now. He has many sons, who are playing a political role, also were part of that power-sharing arrangement. That power-sharing arrangement started to crumble when, the two elements, Ali Muhsin and the Al-Ahmar brothers, started, to develop the perception that the president is mobilizing power within his immediate circle of his family And indeed, a number of security agencies have been headed, by nephews and of the former president. His son is the commander of the most powerful part of the army, which is the Republican Guard, and so on. So it is that perception that evolved about the president preparing his son to take over, monopolizing power, that led, to the others declaring, their opposition. But then, the one thing also that I want to say that is very different also, one characteristic that is different from Syria, in Yemen, sure, the opposition was divided. There were many elements in the opposition. Some are armed, some were not. And then the coalition has various trends, from Islamist party to the old Socialist Party and so on. But, despite the apparent fragmentation, the opposition had a bottom line, and that bottom line was a peaceful transition, but a transition without President Saleh leading it. And I will come back to this very important point. And the negotiations that I facilitated in November, the opposition did not always speak, all of them, with one voice, nor did, in fact, the representatives of the ruling party. And at times I felt like if it's a multi-stakeholder a negotiation, but nevertheless, there was a bottom line, I think, that they all shared, which is the need to enter a new peaceful transition, and then the discussion was more on how to make it an orderly transition. Also, one thing that is very different, and I have to be fair here to Yemen, and when it comes to the casualties and the repression and the violence and so on, there is no comparison whatsoever between what actually happened in Yemen and what is happening in Syria. Just before, we started, this conversation, I was talking to to a friend from Human Rights Watch, and I talked before to Amnesty International. The figures that are being talked about, there is no way of having very precise, reliable, 100% figures, but it seems that the total number of peaceful protesters who were killed in the context of the 11 months or so uprising was around 270, while in Syria, what we hear is a large number, and there is no comparison, between, the two situations. So we need to keep this element and also in mind. I must say also that the one thing that made the difference, and this is the lesson, is the Security Council and the international community all speaking with one voice, something that we don't have, when it comes to Syria. On Yemen, from day one, all the discussions that have taken place about the transition, about the difficulties leading to the Security Council resolution, then the post-agreement discussion, very recent resolution that was passed, very recently. I think the international community had more or less, the same assessment of the situation, that that the fragility of the situation in Yemen will have serious implications in terms of international peace and security, and the international community spoke with one voice for the need for the Yemenis to have a Yemeni-led process and leading to a peaceful transition. And then also a reminder, the Security Council Resolution 2014, when it's called for a political settlement, somewhere else in the text also there was always the word present, the word transition, something that is now very different. I can come back to this when it comes to the different plans being presented, about Syria, at least recently. Also, the other thing that I will have to say is that it wasn't just Security Council speaking with one voice. It was also the region, and we shouldn't forget, and that's why the reason why the agreement is called the implementation mechanism of the GCC initiative. The region also mobilized in support for transition. And that was a critical element that remained. So it was a combined effort, between the UN, the Security Council, the GCC, and various other players. And also, I will conclude, with a couple of other things also that are very important for the Syrian case. Despite everything that one can say, about former President Ali Abdullah Saleh, some strong figures like General Ali Mohsin, Hamid al-Ahmar, and many others. Bottom line is that all of them, and I'm a witness to this, all of them, opposition figures and former president, they all cooperated and showed leadership and in the context of the negotiations that took place in November. And that's why we had an agreement. What we had in the room is a delegation from the opposition, one from the ruling party, but there were strong men, those who have the arms, those who have the means, who are outside of the negotiating room. I stayed in touch with all of them. I worked in them also in parallel, but they are in touch with the negotiators. All of them cooperated, and all of them showed leadership and political will. And that's what led, them to conclude, these negotiations. Also, the one thing that we benefit from in the context of Yemen, unlike many other conflicts around the world, there's always a proliferation of initiatives. I remember in Burundi, I was there in 1994, and we counted that there were something like 21 international envoys that needed to be coordinated. In the case of Yemen, this was much more straightforward. Both sides decided that it's a UN envoy who will facilitate the negotiations, and it was their negotiation and then their agreement. So there was 100% degree of national ownership there. It's not an agreement that emanated from outside. It was a result of face-to-face negotiations between the side, and our role was a facilitation role only. We only took issue with them when it came to issues like international law issues, human rights, women's rights issues. But for most of the agreements, it emanated from their goodwill and from their cooperation. To conclude, I will say that there are lessons to be learned from the Yemeni experience, but these are two different situations. And one thing that I want to remind everybody of is that the Yemenis realize that the balance of power did not favor any one side to win an outright victory through military confrontation. And both sides came to realize that the best way is for them to enter into a direct face-to-face dialogue and to reach a peaceful settlement that will be supported by the international community. At the end of the day, it was Yemeni wisdom that prevailed. When I went to Yemen for the first time, the language that was the discourse was very belligerent among all sides, and it was an atmosphere that is characterized by violence and dangerous violence that could have led Yemen to civil war. But at the end of the day, Yemenis showed leadership, and they ended up with their agreement. And this is why the international community continues to be supportive and will continue to support this agreement. And let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jamal, for an excellent presentation. And thank you also for the comparison between the two situations, Yemen and Syria. If I venture and summarize the differences, I will say there are 7, which you have already cited. We say, obviously, the Syrian regime is stronger, has more control over the territory. The Yemeni regime was weaker, and it was weakened by secession in the south and a problem in the north, so it was weaker. Second, because of what you call the democratic space, the Yemeni had an opposition. Yes, they quarreled between themselves, but they were united before the uprising against the regime. So there was a coherent opposition. Whereas in Syria, I was today reading that in the area of Homs, there are 100 military formations in Homs alone. And thirdly, because Yemen unity in 1990 brought two different social systems, a Marxist social system in the south and a market economy in the north, and the collapse of the Soviet Union compelled the south to seek unity with the north. The basis was only democracy. So there was a democratic space, atmosphere that really helped. And fourthly, the Security Council in Syria is divided, but in Yemen it is united, the Security Council, and the region is united. Whereas that is not the case, because some Arab countries still support the regime, namely Iraq and some other Arab states. Some are having reservations in the Arab League about the issue of Syria, like Algeria, Sudan, and so on. You know, when the split of the military was extremely important in the Yemeni case, and this is the fifth difference, I think. In the Syrian case, in the Yemeni case, and Jamal, I know, told me that he's an expert in the Yemeni army now, but his friend Al-Iryani told me that the forces that split is 110,000. So you had a large force. The other side then thought twice before crushing the uprising. So the rebellious forces made a cordon around the protesters and protected them. So the other side cannot come. And sixth, I think the difference in Yemen, I don't think it's only a question of balance of power. When President Saleh called his military leadership to give him an opinion whether they can crush the opposition, including the First Armored Division, I think it's not only a question of capabilities. I think it's a question of conscience. The Yemeni military said, no, we will not go along with a military solution. You have no alternative from a political course. This is not taking place in Syria. Not that. I think when Saleh realized, this is the seventh, when Saleh realized that there is no alternative, that he cannot do it, that his military will not go along with him, then he went along with a peaceful solution. This is not the case yet in Syria. I think when we speak, Jamal, about the Yemeni model for Syria, I think what is meant not to transcend or overcome all these Yemeni unique conditions. I think it's the question here, the Yemeni model means transfer of power from a president who is disliked to his vice president. Hadi was well respected in Yemen, the vice president in Yemen, and he was acceptable to all. In Syria, we don't know what happened to him. Does anyone? We don't hear anything about what happened to Vice President Sharp. Since the Arab League came with the idea that they want a transfer of power like it happened in Yemen. So I think still, when they mention the Yemeni model, they mean only one thing: transfer of power to the vice president. The vice president then will conduct negotiation with all this opposition and work out a modality for a peaceful resolution in Syria. But with this, I know I made a long summation, but I will open the floor for whoever wants to take it. Yes.
Can you just hold the microphone close to your mouth?
Hi, yes, Letta Taylor from Human Rights Watch. I really enjoyed your presentation, sir.
Can you speak to the microphone?
Yes, Letta Taylor from Human Rights Watch. I very much enjoyed your talk, sir. In your view, what propelled Salah to leave? I mean, you've outlined many things, but in terms of the final push, would you say it was more the threat of targeted sanctions, which was very much in the air, or the promise of immunity?
Does anyone want to take the floor? Yes. Warren.
Warren Hogue, International Peace Institute. That was a fascinating exposition. Thank you so much. I had a question about yet another difference between Syria and Yemen, and that is something you mentioned, which is the vastly greater scale of killing in Syria. My question is, if you could devise, theoretically, a Yemeni model plan for President Assad, for him to leave, his immediate supporters to leave with immunity, how could you offer protection to the thousands of Syrians who would remain behind, who other Syrians would find or hold responsible for the deaths of so many of their countrymen?
Yes.
Thanks very much. Roxanne Bazagan with the DPA, and I've had the pleasure of working with Jamal. I wanted to ask if you thought as well the nature of our engagement and the difference and the timing, and how in Yemen initially it was quite low profile, going in and creating those kind of relationships with the parties, and everything in Syria quite much later engagement and much more high profile. I was wondering as well the lessons about how we actually engage as an international community, or more importantly, from our perspective, the UN, and when we're sending people in that kind of situation. Thanks.
Yeah.
I think what happened is that you have a combination of factors, that led both sides, to realize that there is no other way. There was pressure from the international community, definitely. This was an important element. Security Council speaking with one voice, the region, the GCC action, and so on. But also the one thing that I still recall, public opinion, in Yemen started to demand and become very loud, demanding an end to the crisis and asking the politicians, to end, this the infighting, demanding that the country moves on. And this is, in fact, one thing that we've seen with the symbolism of the elections that took place, the election for the president, the high turnout that exceeded all our expectations. Basically, the message was from the Yemeni people is that it's time for us to move on. We won't change, and it's time for us, to leave this behind. So the public was demanding an end, to the crisis. The business people from both sides were demanding an end, to the crisis, because the country is coming, the economy was coming to a standstill. And I think people also, the Yemeni leaders, showed leadership. That's a bottom line, and I have to insist on this. They could have done it, handled it very differently, but they decided that there is no other way other than working out, a peaceful solution. Unfortunately, the situation in Syria, from what I'm not following the situation in detail, but clearly, the situation is is very different. There is every indication that the government is very confident that it is able to turn around the situation militarily, while in Yemen it was something else. But also on the question of UN engagement, definitely in Yemen we engaged with support from members of Security Council early on. Our engagement, or the engagement of Secretary General, came in different circumstances when it came to Syria. We very quietly consulted with all sides, and we shuttled between the various, different actors. We met with all those who felt that they had no voice. I spent with my colleagues a lot of time in the square arguing and talking to the youth who were demanding immediate change, radical change, and talking to them also about democratic transition, democratic experiences, and what would be, a negotiated, solution that will meet their aspirations for change, but something short of immediate radical change and so on. We spent every time we traveled, it wasn't like what internationals do, which is a visit of 24 hours. Our missions were usually 3 weeks and beyond, and we met with all the actors. We went to Sada, I think I was the first international to meet with the leader of Al-Houthis, Abdul Malik al-Houthi. We met with all the different factions of Iraq, including those with very maximalist agendas and so on. We kept in touch, with all the different factions within the opposition, within also the ruling party. There were different various views and so on. So we spent a lot of time listening to people, something that internationals often don't do voluntarily, and Yemenis had a lot to say, and that listening, I think, evolved into trust. Many Yemenis started to say that the UN has no agenda on its own. We developed a reputation of being impartial, and everything that we said to the opposition is that exactly what we said also to the ruling party. We're very consistent, and that's why I think from the many actors, when the time was ripe. When the Yemeni side, decided, that it's time for them, to have the final face-to-face negotiation that will lead to an agreement. It wasn't a coincidence that they asked the UN. But one thing characteristic of our engagement was the outreach. Second, the low-key also nature of our engagements, for several months. And for several months, since we had these long discussions with all the actors, we started to understand what were the contentious issues, what were the blockages, what will make an agreement a viable one. And that's in the context of all these discussions that we started to see that what is becoming now the Yemeni model is feasible. And it is in this context also that we learned that one key to this transition will be the role that the vice president could play. And because what we noticed from our long conversations with the opposition early on is that they would trust completely the vice president, who comes from the party, they are opposing. It comes from the ruling party, but they all were unanimous that they will trust him to be the leader of this transitional period. And that's why the arrangement that emanated later on, in the context of the agreement, the 3 months delegation of power to the vice president, and then him being elected as the consensus candidate of both sides. So it takes a lot of time to understand, the nuances, to understand the grievances, to understand where different sides are coming from. It takes time And that's what we did. We invested lots of time listening and listening and listening to Yemenis, and also telling them that at the end of the day, they'll have to take charge, they have to take responsibility. The solution can only be a Yemeni one, and this can only be decided by Yemenis, and that's what happened.
Yes, before I have another round, I want to point out that the Syrian opposition is calling on Assad to transfer power to his vice president. The second thing is, in the case of Syria, the vice president, before the Arab League came with a plan, there were a lot of rumors saying that he opposed a military solution. And rumor has it too that he was shot by President Bashar, brother Maher, in the hand in a meeting, because he's opposed to a military solution. So I noticed that the opposition, the Syrian National Council, is calling upon Bashar al-Assad to transfer power to the vice president, and they will negotiate with him, but apparently he's not. The floor is still open. Yes, Walid.
Thank you. I'm from International Human Rights Watch.
Speak to the mic.
Sure.
Whoever speaks should speak to the microphone.
Okay. Yes, I would like to ask Mr. Omar. In regard, you mentioned that the Yemeni model was a successful one, but despite the time, if you look at the time frame, the time of the drafting and trying to convince Ali, it takes months to convince Ali to agree to it. It takes more months for him to sign it, and also it allowed him and his affiliates to continue their political practices or rights. Do you think Ali Abdullah Saleh will be able to run again, or any of his affiliates run again for office in the future, and how you see that connected to the situation in Egypt, where a public outcry happened after one of those both regimes run for office too?
Thank you. Fabien Dubuet with Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF. If I may just add also a difference between the two situations. In Yemen, there is humanitarian access and humanitarian space. In Syria, unfortunately, there is no, in circumstances where our presence is badly needed, especially on the medical front. My question was on the interaction between the humanitarian agenda and the broader mediation efforts. I mean, of course, humanitarian organizations, we always advocate for the integrity of the humanitarian agenda, but I was wondering whether you think that humanitarian access and humanitarian assistance could be a point of entry for broader mediation efforts, if that was the case in Yemen, for instance, and if that could be the case in Syria. Thank you.
Someone else? Yes. Jose.
Hi, Jose Vergad from International Peace Institute. I was just wondering, you insisted on a Yemeni solution. You make so much emphasis about this, but you also said that you emphasized the importance of signing the agreement in Riyadh. So I was wondering if you could explain your that emphasis. Thank you.
Why emphasize Riyadh?
Hello, Stacey Well-Blundell with UNDP. Thank you very much, and I couldn't agree more. There are compelling arguments about the historical differences in terms of the history of democracy, the history of some kind of representative entity. I think also about the sort of, I wanted to come back to the element of consent. And in Yemen, it seems that you have a very, very divided society that has consented to put its arms to one side for the time being, and to see how this transition period goes. I wondered how sustainable you felt that was, and also in the context of the national dialogue, given that, as I have heard, there are elements of the South that will not come to the table unless they're represented as a different country. Whether you saw some of these deeper issues being resolved and some sort of sustainable peace. Thank you.
In response to the first question, definitely, it took a long time, many months of crisis and initiatives and so on. But at the end of the day, the various actors, came to realize that there is no other way other than face-to-face negotiation and a detailed agreement on how to go about a transition. In fact, we have the document here, and I must draw your attention that there are there are two documents. Document number one is a one-page document called the GCC Initiative. That's from April, and the president refused to sign it. It's a very concise paper, but it was not possible to implement it because it starts with the signing of the president, and he refused to sign. The second document is the one that emanated from this face-to-face negotiation between both sides, and it's the roadmap for the transition, and it was called the Implementation Agreement of the GCC Initiative, and it's available here. It's the detailed one that the parties agreed through a process of face-to-face dialogue. The first one, the one-pager, didn't come out of face-to-face negotiation between opposition and the ruling party. It emanated from a statement by the GCC secretariat. Anyway, it took a long time, but that was Yemeni suffered, and also during that time, that was wasted. Pressures increased from the Yemenis on their leaders, and pressure increased from the international community, leading to that face-to-face negotiation and then the agreement. On humanitarian access, I don't think that humanitarian actors had full access to all parts of Yemen, but we are operating our UN humanitarian organizations and other NGOs are operating fairly well in various parts of the country, with some difficulties in areas where there is active conflict, like more recently with Al-Qaeda occupying a big chunk of Abiyan. It was impossible for our colleagues to have access, although ICRC did have some access at some point. And then in other parts of the country, like in the north, we often had difficulties. And this was one of the issues that we have been continually discussing with the de facto authorities there. But I don't think that in the case of Yemen, it was necessary to negotiate a humanitarian agreement that will be the building block for another agreement that is more political. I think the situation was ripe for a negotiation on a transition. So as I said, all those who came together to negotiate, they had, one bottom line, which is that they are coming together to negotiate a peaceful transfer of power. They came together to negotiate how to, in detail, affect a transition. There was no quarrel about the principle. The bottom line, the starting point was very clear, and that was in line with the language of Security Council Resolution 2014, and it was in line also with the initial GCC initiative. Why the agreement was signed in Riyadh? Well, we felt as UN that GCC countries played a major role, and particularly Saudi Arabia, in helping with the Yemen situation. And we expect also the neighbors and Saudi Arabia, the big country next door, to continue to play a positive role in support of Yemen. And we are very grateful, to the Saudi government, for hosting, what became, historic signing, and also the arrangement that's led, to that signing. I can write a book about how we spent a whole night negotiating how we get the arrangement made. It wasn't that easy at all. But one thing that we were very conscious of is that agreement was reached between the negotiators. They asked me to present the outcome to the president. I went to see him. We went through the agreement. And then he asked me to make the arrangement for the signing. That is a signing, that is a ceremony that is commensurate with the importance of this event. And my immediate reaction was that we look at the possibility of a signing, with the presence of the Saudi king, and that's what happened. How sustainable is this agreement? For me, this agreement, the implementation is on track. There is no doubt about it. It's largely on track. As stated in the agreement, a government of national unity was formed immediately after signing. Elections were held. They went very well. As I said, it's the voter turnout exceeded expectations. Youth participated in voting for the new president. A military commission was established. It's cleared. Many of the roadblocks and so on. A committee was established for dialogue with the youth. The president decided, as stated in the agreement, a committee was formed to start preparations for the national dialogue. It's called a contact committee. They are now consulting with the various constituencies and so on. Some of the members of this committee are now in Cairo discussing the participation of the members of the Hirak, leaders of the Hirak in the upcoming national dialogue. All this, what is stated in the agreement, is being implemented. There are challenges, and I am not underestimating the obstacles, the difficulties, and so on. And this is why the Security Council, very conscious of the difficulties, the Security Council stepped up to the plate and decided to issue another resolution. It was a resolution by consensus, recognizing that there are challenging. And in this resolution, there is a clear expression of support for the new president and his effort to lead this transition. Second, there's something interesting in this resolution, which is it warns anyone who may want to impede the implementation of the agreement, that Security Council will take the necessary measures, including under Article 41 of the Charter. Let me stop here.
Please.
My name is Rafa. I'm from the U.S. Federation.
I'm from the U.S. Federation for Middle East Peace. My question to you, Sayyid Omar, what is it your advice you could give to the international community to stop the bloodshed in Syria? It has been over 16 months, and we see people killing, no respect for human rights. And I think lately he's probably tried to use the Air Force, because yesterday one of the pilots left to Jordan. What advice you can give the international community to stop something like this? It's sad to the humanity, these things still going. Thank you.
Omar Aboud, DPKO. Just what's the future plan for the UN involvement in Yemen from now on, in terms of presence on the ground, political mission, and your personal role in the implementation of the roadmap? Thank you.
Look, in talking about the the Yemeni model and its relevance, for Syria, my main point was that first let's understand what happened in Yemen, because quite often, when Yemen is mentioned in relation to Syria, what I see is that often, what happened in Yemen is not clearly understood. And here in this context, I want to emphasize the fact that what happened in Yemen was a face-to-face negotiation among Yemenis. There was a Yemeni process, and that Yemeni process led to Yemenis agreeing on a power-sharing arrangement. So they agreed to make certain arrangements during a transitional period until, so they agree on the rules of the game, change the constitution, they agree on an electoral system, after having a national dialogue that is inclusive, involving everybody, and then go for general elections, competitive elections. And whoever win, will be a legitimate winner. So that's what the Yemenis agreed on, and the role of the international community, our role, was to support them to seek a compromise along the lines of what they did. And there was no imposition from outside. Our role was very much a supportive role, and at the request of both sides, they asked the UN to facilitate that agreement that became the roadmap of the transition. This happened at their request. The lesson we can learn here is that unless the local actors engage, unless the local actors develop the political will to solve their problems peacefully, the situation in Syria will continue to degenerate in an all-out war with many casualties, as we have seen. But also the one thing that we can draw from the Yemeni experience is the fact that at some point during the crisis, both sides realized that there can be no winner. And this is what we don't have in the Syrian case, from what I see. Probably one side, believes that they can turn it around through military means. If that belief is there and strong, I don't see any conditions for any face-to-face negotiation at the Yemeni style that could lead to an agreement. Bottom line is that there is every indication that from what I see, that the government believes that they're able to turn around, the situation using military means. And as long as that belief is there and strong, I don't see any prospect for talks leading to a transition agreement. And I don't see also an opposition that has a certain degree of coherence in the way we have seen it in the Yemeni case, although there are differences and so on, but both sides agreed on the principle, which is a transition. The word transition is not in the Kofi Annan plan, to start with. The word transition, I don't see it even in Security Council statement. Unless that bottom line, become shared and accepted by all sides, I don't see how talks can begin for a transition. So that's what makes the huge difference. What next for the UN? The UN has been in Yemen for decades. The UN has been very active in both the humanitarian and development fields. Our humanitarian actors have focused much more recently on an appeal that is unfortunately not fully funded, but however, there is more and more interest in the international community in supporting it. There is a humanitarian crisis that requires a lot of work. But on the political side, as stated in the Security Council resolution, more recently, the Secretary General will continue his good offices focusing on supporting the Yemenis in their effort to organize the national dialogue. We can be doing many things, but when it comes to the political side, we feel that what will make or break this transition is the national dialogue, whether it's going to succeed or fail. And Yemenis will need lots of support during this time for the Yemeni national dialogue to succeed, because it's really the spine of this transition. It is in the Yemeni national dialogue where they're going to discuss for the first time in an inclusive way how to solve the southern issue, how to address the issues of Sada, how to address issues of national reconciliation and transitional justice. And then, very important, that's where the constitutional debate is going to start on the structure of the state, the political system. It is very important for this national dialogue to succeed, and I think Yemenis can make it with the support of the international community, and that's why our focus is going to be solely on this set of issues, hopefully leading to a successful national dialogue, a constitutional review, and then elections that we'll support in February 2014. That's going to be our focus.
Thank you for this lucid answer to the questions. If there is no one, I'm going to ask a question of my own. And again, I want to relate it to Syria. The Yemeni opposition refused to negotiate with President Saleh after the 18th of March, the massacre of people. So it was the vice president that conducted the negotiation, not the president, not President Saleh. Because after the massacre of people, to the opposition, he lost legitimacy. And I agree with you. I think Jamal is right. In the Arab League plan for Syria was clear about negotiation between the vice president Shar' and the Syrian opposition. But it is the threat of veto in the Security Council that reduced the Syria resolution to a minimum. It does not have anything. But isn't it the case that the vice president Hadi in the end, after March 18, is the one who led the negotiations? And it's very interesting because he was the second man in the ruling party, but he played the role of the arbiter. And I think this is why I think in the Yemeni case there was some success in the negotiations.
In general, when it comes to the Syria and the political process, I have no recipe. I have no concrete, suggestions. The only thing that I'm emphasizing is that we cannot transplant models because each country is unique and has its own set of circumstances. But there are some lessons that we can draw from the Yemeni experience for sure, and I tried, to outline some of them. Just to respond to what you said, definitely, one characteristic of the crisis for several months, what was happening is that confrontations were taking place, skirmishes were taking place in various parts of the country. Violence was escalating, and the one thing that we found during our first visit is that there was no contact between ruling party and opposition. And if there is no discussion, no contact whatsoever, I think both sides are more likely to become maximalist in their position. So in the Yemeni context, I'm not talking about Syria because it's a completely different situation. In that context, the position we took as the UN is that both sides will need to talk directly. This position was not very popular. I was criticized by many. Many had the view that the only solution is that for President Saleh to sign and the crisis will end, and that's the solution. I was of the view that the one pager to be signed doesn't have enough detail, is not a roadmap that is enough detailed, to give clarity on how this transition is going to be initiated, how it's going to be managed. And that's why what was needed is for both sides to work out, an arrangement, short of an outright signing and immediate resignation. And that's why, we pushed for this face-to-face dialogue, and many were surprised in July during one of our visits that the opposition met in my presence. That was the first time ever with the vice president. And after 1 week of meetings, they agreed on many issues that became really the outlines of the blueprint that evolved later on in the face-to-face formal negotiations of November. But again, that was that opportunity that of these meetings in July, that made me convinced that having seen how the opposition was interacting with the vice president, that he was the man who could play a leading role, leading this transition. And it was in July when I became very convinced, that the opposition will trust the vice president to be the leader of the transition, and he will be their candidate also for the opposition in the elections. And that's what happened later on. So definitely in the Yemeni case, having these face-to-face negotiations helped. And one thing that I must say is that when they were together, face-to-face negotiating, they were much more realistic than when messages were transmitted through third-party intermediaries. The face-to-face format helped moderate the views of all sides. But that's Yemen, and I don't see the prospect anytime soon of any scenario like this when it comes to Yemen, as long as you have one side, which is the government side, convinced that they're able to crash the uprising and turn the situation around through military means. Unless both sides, started to see, a balance of power that that is more conducive to a negotiated settlement, it's not going to happen.
I totally agree with you. I think this is a very correct assessment. But I want to thank you also for an excellent presentation, very informative discussion. And I thank you with your humility. You shed a lot of light on Syria. You keep saying that, Syria is a different case, but the comparative, the lessons you are drawing between the two experiences is extremely important for Syria. And I agree with you. Assad will not move until he realizes that his war is not sustainable. And I agree with you. And that when he realizes that there will be a shift in the balance of forces, he will come to realize, but probably late, that he has to strike a deal. But thank you very much. And let's give Mr. Benomar a good hand. He has been excellent. Thank you very much.